Over the past 100 days, I've uploaded one long-form tutorial every single day. To celebrate this fact, I thought that I'll share with all of you 25 tips that I learned over the past 100 days. And to start off the tips, let's talk about how we can start up the Blender file to save a lot of time. If you see yourself doing something every single time, such as if you watch my tutorials, you see we set all of these render defaults as well as output defaults by changing the frame rate to 30 frames per second, the end frame to wherever we want it to be, and we change a few of the output folder directories and the formats. If you don't want to do this every single time, you can actually make the changes as you please, and once you're done with making all the changes, you can go to File, Defaults, Save Startup File. If you do this, the next time you open up Blender, you won't have to manually make the changes again, and it'll already be set by default. I, however, don't do this because I want everybody to be able to follow along with all of these changes as well every single tutorial. The next powerful tip that we're going to talk about is the delta transforms. If you actually have a file like this where you have some object, it could be any object with any type of complex animation. This is a fairly simple one, but you might have one with fairly complex animations. Now you just want a duplicate that's going to happen towards the right and the left, or maybe you just want a trail of this. So you could press Shift DY and move it to the side, maybe Shift DY again, move it to the side. But now if you were to play the animation, you see all of them directly move to the exact same place. We do have all three cubes, but they have the keyframes already added to them, so they remain over here. Now one way that you could change this is by expanding this, going down, selecting these object transforms, and then deleting these individual keyframes. Or you could select this, move it to the side, and then again apply a keyframe and overwrite the keyframe. So you'd have to go to wherever the keyframe is, press GY, move it to the side, I apply the keyframe. But that could be a headache if you have multiple keyframes added in. So to help with that, you can actually go to the object properties over here, expand delta transform, and just give it a delta transform. So if we go to frame 0 and we change the Y location to maybe -2, and then select the other cube and move that even further back, when you play the animation, you can see that they all have the exact same animations added to them, except they're shifted on the y-axis by a certain amount. You can also play around with the scale values to just make it absolutely the way you want it to be. So that's just something useful in many scenarios. In this next tip, I'll show you how to create 2.5D animations like this one. If you actually look at the original blend file, you'll realize that everything present over here are actually just images. So if we take a look at these light rays, they're images, the chairs are actually just images, and so are the people, and almost everything in this scene are just different images that have been stacked together in three-dimensional space to create this particular room. And just by moving the camera a little bit, you get parallax effect that actually makes this look really complex, but it's actually really simple to do. To get this sort of an animation, all you do is go to your Edit, Preferences, and under the Add-ons tab, make sure that you have Import Images as Planes checked. So if this is checked, you can go ahead and press Shift-A, Image, and you can search for images as planes. Now you can select whichever image you want. So let's take, for example, this one. So keep the blend mode at blend or hashed. So I tend to prefer blend. You can keep show backface ticked so that you can view it from the other side as well. And for the material type, it's best to choose emit so that even without any scene lights, the image can actually be seen. So once you check emit and click import images as planes, you now have a new image which you can scale up and place it in the scene according to your desires. And that way you can create this amazing 2.5D effect. And the best part about this is that it renders really, really fast. Next is a really useful tip about rotations. If you were to rotate an object in multiple axes, so let's say I add in a keyframe initially, then go to some arbitrary frame and then rotate it about the x-axis by 90 degrees and tap I rotation. And then let's say I now wanted to rotate about the y-axis and then I want to rotate it about its x-axis again. Let's go to frame 60, say RY, maybe we'll go with 270 and type I location rotation scale. And then if we were to rotate it about the x-axis, let's say we want that. So we rotate it about the x-axis by 180 degrees. It seems like the rotation happened perfectly. You can type I location rotation scale. However, when you actually play this back, you can see there's some really weird rotations going on. So it turns like this, it turns and then it does some weird rotation. So that's really hard to get around because this happens due to the way Blender calculates multiple rotations. Over here, you see there's a mode, there's an XYZ Euler, and you can actually choose the order of operations. Getting into this can be a little math intensive, but essentially it's sometimes really hard to get the right type of rotation. Now you could add in different empties and have different controllers to get the same effect done. So to fix that issue, a method that I found to work is by using the geometry node editor. We'll bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window and change this to the geometry node editor. Now make sure that you apply all transforms initially. So just press Ctrl A and click apply all transforms and then press this plus button to create a new geometry node tree. Now you can zoom in and just rotate using different transform geometry nodes. So search for a transform geometry and plug that in. Now we had three different operations. First, we wanted to rotate about the x-axis and then about the y-axis and then the x-axis again. So just press Shift D twice and play around around with the rotations separately. So the first rotation was on the x-axis, so we'll just hover over the value and tap I, go to whichever arbitrary frame we want and rotate it by 90 degrees and tap I. Then we'll also hover over this transform geometry and tap I, and then go to the next place, and we want it to rotate about the y-axis, so we type, again, it was 270, so let's type 270 and then tap I. And while we're at the same frame, hover over the third one and tap I, and then go to the next frame and rotate it about the x-axis by whatever amount you want, 180, and tap I. Now when you actually play the animation, we have the exact animation that we wanted, and it's not going to do that weird rotation thing. So that way we don't actually have to bother about it, and we get the rotations absolutely right. So that might be a very specific use case, but trust me, it comes in handy quite a bit when you see some particular rotation is not happening and you get really frustrated. The next tip that we'll talk about is actually constraints. They're heavily underutilized. So if you go to the constraint tab over here, you can actually add in different constraints to the object. One such example is the maintain volume. So if you actually do this, no matter how you try to scale it, the volume remains the same. So even though we're scaling it only on the x-axis, it automatically scales on the z-axis and the y-axis proportionally to maintain the same volume. So this can actually be used to create a nice bouncing ball animation or things like that. For example, we can just move it up, and whenever we go down by pressing GZ, once we want to squish it down on the z-axis, we just press SZ and move it down, and it automatically flattens out on the other axes as well. And in this case, we've kept the free axis as the y-axis, so it squishes only on the y-axis. But what we do is we change the free axis to the z-axis, and now when we press GZ, we get a nice squishing ball animation, and you can actually animate this to have it wobble about quite a bit. So that's just a really easy way to create this particular animation. Other constraints involve things like using the limit distance function. So for this you need a target, so let's search for an empty plane axis and then just move this to the side. Now for the target, we can choose the empty and we can give it a maximum distance. So this ball can no longer move away from that distance no matter how much you move it. So that way you can actually keyframe its positions and get it to go through a perfect circle and just maintain the position within that certain distance from this particular empty. Beyond that, there are a lot more constraints that you definitely should check out. We even have the floor constraint, which allows us to select a specific floor. So let's press Shift A mesh plane and scale it up. And then if you take this sphere and try to move it below the plane, it won't move as long as you select that as the target. Let's choose the plane as the target. And now when we move it down, the origin of this ball will never go below the floor. So that is going to help you even more in the bouncing ball animation. However, for that, you have to change the origin of this sphere to the bottom, which brings us to our next tip, which is actually setting the origin. So to set the origin, you can actually use the 3D cursor. So you can tab into edit mode and select the bottommost vertex by going to vertex select mode and just selecting it. Once you've selected the bottommost vertex, you can press Shift S, cursor to selected. And once the cursor moves to the selected region, you can press tab to go back into object mode and click object, set origin to 3D cursor. So when you do this, the origin automatically moves to the 3D cursor. And now when you press GZ and move it down, it'll no longer cross underneath the plane. So remember, adding in the origin to the specific region is very useful because whenever you perform any scaling operations, they always scale from the point of origin. Even when you rotate it, it always rotates from the point of the origin. So in case you want to have these types of rotations, it's actually really easy by just changing the point of origin and then having the rotation be like this instead of having the sphere just rotate about its center. So all of these are different things that you can do by setting the origin according to the position of your 3D cursor, which you can set by pressing Shift S after selecting the correct or appropriate face that you want. So you can select it, press Shift S, cursor to selected, tab to go into object mode and set origin to 3D cursor. So that is just different operations that you have. The next tip that I'd like to talk about is the shortcuts. Remember, shortcuts are really simple and helpful. For example, you can always press Alt G to clear location, Alt R to clear rotation, Alt S to clear the scale, and things like that. However, it's sometimes really hard to know more complex shortcuts, and you might not even know what shortcuts exist. To actually get a list of all the shortcuts, Blender actually has one present right in the Edit, Preferences, and KeyMap. When you go to the KeyMap, you can actually go down and see all of the different operations that are possible and what the operation is mapped to. So for example, you can see exactly what happens when you do different movements using all of your keys or your mouse for every single type of operation that is possible in Blender. So in the 3D viewport, you can see what can you do to a mesh. You can actually go ahead and tweak the mesh in different ways, and you can see what the different operations are. And you can always add in new operations and choose what you want it to do and change it according to exactly your needs. The amount of customization you have is really high by even expanding these and actually changing these to exactly what you want. And in case you're unsure about a specific thing that you want to do, you can always come up to this search bar over here and search for what you want. So maybe I want a clear rotation. I can just type for clear rotation and it'll tell me exactly what the shortcut is. I can just search for clear and I can see all of the different shortcuts and all of the different things that I can clear technically. Sometimes you make mistakes and you want to undo what you've just done. Control Z works, but there's a limit up to which you can actually undo your steps. So in my situation, it's going to be only 32 steps. After 32, no matter how many times I press Control Z, we don't get what happened just before that. So if you want to actually increase this, you can always go to your edit, preferences, and then go to your system and increase the number of undo steps to whatever number you feel you would require. Remember, the higher this is, the more RAM it'll take. But in general, a number like 64 is good enough because it doubles the number of undo steps that you generally would have if you don't play around with this. But if you're really clumsy and would want even more and have a good amount of RAM, you can always increase it to 128 or 256. Sometimes we face the issue that even if we have our camera selected and we position it according to whatever look we want, we don't know whether or not the object in focus is really within the center of the camera, and we just have to eyeball it. Instead of doing that, you can actually go to your object properties here, expand viewport display, and expand composition guides, and actually use any of these composition guides. So in this case, since I wanted to center my sphere, I'm going to go ahead and select center, and now you have a line through the center, and we can clearly see that it was not centered. So I can move the camera accordingly till it becomes perfectly centered. You have other types as well, and you can select multiple of them so that all of the composition guides are present and you can use them to your advantage. Next, I want to talk about using the LightPath node. We've done that in multiple tutorials before, but it's actually very useful and many people don't use it. Let's suppose I want the background to be lit very brightly using this particular background node, but I want the color of the background to be maybe a green. But if I was to just change this to green, you see even the plane also becomes green because it takes on the reflection of the light. If I don't want that, I can keep this at the same white itself and search for a mix shader node, plug that in over here, and for the second texture, I can search for a background node or press Shift D with this background node selected, plug that into the bottom socket and change this to the green that I wanted. Next, to make sure that the green is seen only in the camera, I can press Shift A and search for a LightPath node, and then I can use isCameraRay and plug that into the factor. This way, the entire scene is going to get affected by the background node over here, but when we look at it through our camera or through our viewport, what we see is going to be the second shader over here. There's actually a lot more control that can be done with this LightPath node, but I think that deserves a video by itself. However, this effect I use a lot and I really think it's worth sharing. This way, you can actually light up a scene using an HDRI, but still have a single color present in the back. The next tip that we'll talk about is something that we use in the 3D viewport, but we don't know can happen in other windows as well. To zoom in, your mouse scroll wheel doesn't give a smooth scroll. So to make it smooth, generally you can press Control and the middle mouse button and then just drag your mouse to smoothly zoom in and zoom out. However, what you might not know is that that works not just in the 3D viewport, it also works in your shader nodes. It also works in your properties windows and things like that. So you can actually just press Control middle mouse button and zoom in and zoom out in case something seems too small and you're unable to see it. And suppose you want to see the entire thing, but you can't see it because the text is too large, you can also Control middle mouse button and just zoom out till you see what the actual word is. So those are different things that you can do with this particular option. Next, if you ever come across a situation where you have way too many nodes and you can't zoom in enough and you don't want to make the screen way too large every single time, you can actually just press Control spacebar and that'll actually make that screen full screen so that you can zoom in and use the entire available space to work with it. Then to go back, you just press Control spacebar again and it goes back to where it was. And this works for any of the windows. Just hover over the window and press Control spacebar and it becomes full screen. You can do that to actually check whatever you want, and even in the outliner you can get an easier list, and just Control spacebar brings it back, which is really useful in certain operations. Now suppose you've created some object in a previous Blender file, you can actually just copy and paste it in fairly easily. For example, in this particular Blender file, let's say I want to use this particular planet that I already created. I can actually just select this planet, press Ctrl C, move on to the other file that I have and press Ctrl V. And that way the planet gets pasted within this particular blend file with all of the textures and everything added in. Similarly, you can just select whatever object you want, Ctrl C, move it into the new blend file and press Ctrl V. You might have to reposition them, but they come in with all of the textures. It might take a few seconds for the textures to load in as well. You have to make sure that the settings in both the files are the same as well. For example, in this case, I haven't enabled screen space refraction, and that's why you weren't able to see through the glass material. Now let's say you want to go into edit mode. So let's select this and tab to go into edit mode, and you want to select both vertices and edges. You can actually just shift select the options to select both the modes. So now you can select both vertices as well as edges. So that is something that might be helpful for you. So in this case, if you actually shift select the face as well, you can just select face faces and play around with selecting exactly which type you want to select. If you want to select just the vertex, you can. If you want to select an entire face, you can, and it's really up to you. So that way, when you extrude, you can extrude both faces as well as edges. You can also extrude vertices as well. So this might come in handy for you. It's just something that I did not know could be done until very late in my Blender journey. And coming to learning things way too late in my Blender journey, something that isn't spoken about too much because I believe it's maybe common sense to most people. If you actually right click after selecting an edge, you actually get so many options that you can do to it. In this case, I have all three of the options selected, so you get a different menu for each of them. So you have a vertex menu, edge menu, and a face menu. If I was to switch only to face select mode and I right click, I get the face select option. So I can select the face and just subdivide by right clicking on it. So these are different things that I didn't know was possible because Blender version 2.79 or versions till 2.79 used right click to select anything. When I migrated to Blender version 2.8, I continued to use Blender 2.79 settings, so my selection was always right click and not left click. So I never knew that there was options available when you right click, even after I did decide to finally switch to have left click as select. And since I didn't know this, I believe there might be at least one or two other people present that did not know about this feature. So I thought it was worth mentioning in this particular video. Now let's suppose I already have an object that has some sort of animation just like this. Now I want another object, let's say a UV sphere, to also get the same exact animation. Instead of animating it in the exact same way, what you can do is press Shift and select the object that has all of the keyframes added in already, and then press Ctrl L and click Link Animation Data. That way the sphere is going to do the exact same thing as the cube. Now you can't see it because it's hidden behind the cube, but if you use one of the tips that was taught a bit earlier, you can go to the delta transforms and just move it on one of the axes, and that way you'll be able to see the different items share the exact same animation data. Now Ctrl L doesn't work only for linking animation data. You can also link materials so that they have the same material. You can also copy their modifier stacks and do various operations that you can check out using this particular list. Apart from that, another really cool thing is setting the origin. You can actually tap N, go to the tool option over here and click affect only origins, and that way when you apply any of the transformations, only the origins will move. So let's select this object and press GX and just move the origin to the position that I want. So that's something that you could do as well. But remember, this is not only for just origins. You can also choose affect only parents. So let's say I took this particular sphere and I parented it to this particular cube by pressing Ctrl P. Now if I was to select this cube and press RX, you'll see the sphere also moves along with it. Now let's say I want to actually rotate this cube a little bit before I have this parenting constraint added in. Instead of removing the parent constraint and playing around with all of that, what we can do is check the affect only parents and then press RX and just move it to whatever position I want, and then uncheck this, and that way we can now move them around fairly easily. This works extremely well when you have a huge number of child parent constraints and the chain is fairly long. This is a real time saver as well. Sometimes in Blender there are operations that you want to repeat multiple times. For example, if I want to actually duplicate this sphere and rotate it about its origin, which is at the origin of the world, by 45 degrees, but I want to duplicate that every single time, I could press Shift D R Z 45 and then do that again, Shift D R Z 45. But instead of typing that every single time, I can also just press Shift R to repeat the last action that I tapped before tapping enter. So in that case, I can do this as many times as I want. Now this doesn't work only in object mode. I can also press tab to go into edit mode, and maybe I want to extrude this particular face by 5 units. I can press E2 and I can repeat that multiple times by pressing Shift R, and that'll just repeat the action again. Shift R, and that way I just get it repeatedly extruded. So those are different operations that you can do multiple times as well. Another situation that you might face is where you have different options enabled and you want to check which one looks better and which one doesn't. So in this case, suppose I want to check whether I want the bloom or I want to change the intensity of the bloom down to maybe 0.01. So in this case, I can actually use something called render slots, which is underutilized in Blender. To use render slots, you have to click on render image, and then once the image is actually rendered, you'll see that it's being rendered in a specific slot. You can go ahead and change the slot to something like slot number 2 by tapping this button and then choosing slot number 2. And once you switch to slot number 2, you can go back and change all of the settings that you want. So in this case, I'll increase the intensity to 0.1, and then I'll go ahead and press render image again. Now this is going to be stored in slot number 2. So just by tapping 1 and 2, I can switch between the different slots. So this is slot number 1, and you can see how it is with intensity of 0.05, and on slot 2 I have it with an intensity of 0.1. So that way I can see the differences and just compare between them. And this doesn't have to be only situations like this, because you also have the time that it took for the renders to happen. So in this case, let's say this particular cube has subdivision surface modifiers added to it. Maybe I can go ahead and change the actual number in the render and then press the render button to see what difference it makes in the render and the render speeds to actually judge whether or not it's necessary to have that much of subdivisions present. So in this case, I've kept this at slot 1 and slot 2 has my subdivisions at level 3 itself. And now I can actually go over here and just press between 1 and 2 and see the differences in the subdivision level and the time it took. So in this case, it just took about 2 extra seconds to create the subdivisions, but the change is almost negligible. So that's why I think it's a good enough idea to reduce the subdivision levels as well. So those are different things that you can do with render slots. Another thing that sometimes happens is when you have materials that have a lot of nodes, it sometimes becomes too clustered and hard to mess around with. So in order to reduce the amount of area that these nodes are taking, you can always zoom in and press this little arrow mark to hide the texture. Now, if you don't want to keep going to the arrow mark, an easier way to do that is just select the node and tap the letter H, and that way it gets hidden just like that. But the problem with this is that you don't have access to any of the different options available on each of these nodes. So if you want to keep the actual options available, instead of tapping H, you can actually select it and press Ctrl H, and that way only the unused sockets are going to be hidden, but the rest of the options still remain available. And to make everything really fast, you can select everything and then press Ctrl H, and that way all of the unused sockets will be hidden and you just have the main options available, and this takes up lesser space and keeps it fairly organized. Another thing that you can do is also switch on your snapping in the material shader editor, and that way you can actually get these to align up much better, and that sometimes just helps you understand the node tree better, and keeping things organized always keeps you motivated to continue creating and making more complex materials without making it seem like it's taking too much of effort or it is too complex. Next, let's talk about viewport render image. So let's say you want to actually render out this floor as well. If you expand this, you generally have quite a lot of options that are available. Now, when you render the image, let's say you don't want most of these, you can just go ahead and switch off everything except for the things that you want. So let's say I want only the floor and I don't even want the X and Y axes to be seen. You can switch those off as well. And that keeps just the floor present. Now you can press 0 to go into your camera view and then press view, viewport render image or viewport render animation. And if you're in your camera view and your camera has some animations, even that is going to be rendered out as well. If you click viewport render image, what happens is you get an image, but it's going to take the sample count that is present in your render settings for the viewport. So let's go to slot 2 and see that you can actually increase this viewport samples to the same thing that you would have rendered it out at. And once you put it at that value, you can click view, viewport render image. And now when you compare between the two, you can clearly see that you are able to get the quality to the same level that it would have been if you were to render this out normally. So that's just something that you can do to get all of these infinite grids and things like that present. And you can also have your 3D cursor and make other outlines and stuff present as well. Now let's say there's a lot of objects present in your scene like this one, and you don't know what the name of this object is. Sometimes even in the outliner, there might be way too many objects and it'll be really hard for you to figure these out. So one thing that you could do is just select the object in your 3D viewport and press F2, and that way you can just rename it then and there itself. So I can call this clock, and then just to find the clock, I can just come up here and search for clock and it automatically appears. So that's just a faster way to rename things instead of searching for it in the outliner, because sometimes it's genuinely hard. And remember, some things are sometimes parented to other objects as well. And in case something is parented, it gets hidden within the other object. So let's say I select this and I press Ctrl P, set parent to object. Now, if I was to just select the cube, I wouldn't be able to find it in the outliner because it's present inside this particular object. So if I expand sphere, only then will the cube one appear, which is my dice. So often it's not easy to know exactly what is parented to what and where I'll be able to get it even if I select this. So that's why it's easier to just press function F2, call this dice, and then in the outliner I can just search for dice and I'll know exactly where it is. It's under sphere 6. Then I can rename that as well. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is another add-on that's present within Blender itself that people don't talk about enough. To actually light the background or to get different environment textures, textures, most people will either use an HDRI or over here they'll use the inbuilt sky texture. Now in Eevee, this sky texture is not really that great because the actual good sky texture is not available in Eevee, or at least the sun disk isn't, and you don't have too many controls present over here. So another really nice add-on that is present that you'll have to enable by going to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and searching for Dynamic Sky. Now once you actually check Dynamic Sky, you can actually tap N and go to Create, and then you'll see there's another Dynamic Sky option, and you can press this Create button to create the new Dynamic Sky. So once I press this Create button, it automatically shifts 2 cycles, but I don't actually want cycles, so I'm going to change the render engine back to Eevee because it actually works with Eevee as well. Then you'll have to go to the world properties and choose the new world that was created, which will be labeled as Dynamic 1. Now with Dynamic 1, you can actually change the horizon color and play around with it, and the best part is that you also get these clouds added in as well. You have a lot of control over the actual sun. You have control over where the sunlight is going to be coming from by playing around with this, and of course you can change the cloud colors and just have a lot of fun with this particular setup, which actually gives really cool results, and I genuinely like this. I'm just really sad that I did not know about this earlier because it would have helped in a lot of my scene setups. Now another thing is, in a situation like this, Blender crashes or might crash quite a bit. So in case you have issues with Blender crashing, something that people don't know is that you can actually auto-save your Blender files. You can go to your Edit, Preferences, and go to Save and Load. Here you can actually check the autosave button and change your timer so that it saves once every that many minutes. So in this case, let's say 1 minute, it'll save every minute. Now if at all your Blender does crash, you can open Blender again and then go to File, Recover, and click on Autosave. When you click on this, it opens to the autosave folder, and you can see the date modified, and whatever the latest autosave file is or the time closest to when it crashed, you can go ahead and select that and click Recover Autosave, and that way you don't lose too much of your progress. The last tip that I want to give is that Blender can be used as a game engine. For that, you either need to use Armory 3D, which is an add-on to Blender, using which you can use different logic nodes and create various 3D games, and you can export them to any platform. In fact, I've even been able to create very simple Android app games as well using Armory 3D. Apart from that, if you don't want to use it as a separate add-on, you can go ahead and use UPBGE, which is a separate Blender build itself, which uses logic nodes as well as logic bricks like the old Blender game engine, which has been removed ever since Blender version 2.8 came out. But it uses that as a separate branch and allows you to create really cool games that can be exported to either Windows, Linux, or Mac OS. So if you're into game development, this might be something that you would genuinely enjoy creating with. I really hope this video gave you some tips or tricks that you didn't know before. Definitely comment down below the number of tips that you already knew, or comment the number of tips that you learned new in this particular video. If I've missed out your favorite tip, be sure to let us know in the comments as well so that others can benefit from that as well. This was the 250th video that has been uploaded on my channel, and it's the 100th video that I released within 100 days. I never thought that I would be able to create 100 different ideas in the time span of 100 days. So I'm actually really thankful for all of the people that watch my videos, regularly comment, and keep supporting the channel. Although this channel still hasn't been monetized, and I don't think that it will get monetized anytime soon at the current rate it's growing, I still feel like this channel is one of the biggest projects that I've worked on, and I'm really glad I did it. I have a lot more to say, but I'll save that up for another video that I'll probably release when I hit 1,000 subscribers, which I'm hoping will happen fairly soon. So until all of those videos come out, be sure to check out other videos on my channel and keep creating, and always remember, stay creative.